This is My Taste is Better Than Yours, the manga podcast where Guardian Enzel and I, Samu, discuss some of our favourite series and figure out, is my taste better than yours? Hello everyone, it's Samu here hosting this time, and as you can see, based on the title, we're back with Hunter x Hunter, and it's the big one, and it's so big that we're going to split it into 2 episodes because there's so much I feel like we can talk about. Enzo, how are you feeling? We've been teasing and building up, talking about the Chimera Ant arc, and we're finally here. Well, how are you feeling?
Overrated.
Uh, some people will say that. Some people actually do
Yeah,
say
I
that.
know. I know. No, I'm in awe, I'm a little bit in awe of the prospect of even talking about it, and that's coming from someone who wrote 60 episodic posts on it on the manga on the anime version, some of which went over 1,000 words. So I probably wrote 50,000 words on this for LIA. So, and even me, I'm a little odd at the prospect of trying to dissect it in one conversation.
Well, let's give it a go. Let's give it a bash.
All right,
So
gambare.
here we are. This is Hunter x Hunter Chimera Ant arc. This published from the years 2003 to 2011. So this was the arc that started to become victim to the Togashi hiatuses. And yeah, to give a little synopsis, even though I'm sure everyone who's already familiar with the series knows, it's the longest arc in the series, and immediately after Greed Island, Gon and Killua have encountered Kite, and this like left turn that we got at the end of Greed Island leads us towards this grip that Kite has and the involvement of the Chimera Ants coming from beyond the world that we already know. And it takes us to the country of NGL. And this is very much Gon and Killua's story, their involvement and the Hunter Association's involvement with this potential threat to the whole of humanity. So it's a big one. Because it is a big one, I'm going to ask you, Enzo, to try and condense this big one into less than a minute. Let's just start
Mm.
off on broad level. This is no spoiler. We both love Hunter x Hunter, but why? If you could describe in a few words, like why does this arc work for you so much?
I love it because it breaks every rule in the book from a storytelling standpoint. It does not do anything conventionally. It does things which should be impossible and yet are possible. It has a staggeringly good cast of characters above and beyond Gon and Killua, who in fact are disappear off the page for long stretches of it without it losing any momentum. And because sort of it sort of exemplifies the unconventional nature of Togashi's writing right up to the way he chooses to end the arc. So and also just because it's so fucking deep. It's an incredibly deep story with some themes that are really, really, really powerful and really complex. So in a minute or less than a minute, hopefully that's my answer.
Okay, you pass. You made it. For me. It's the ambition. My other favorite, this and my other favorite, the current ongoing Succession Contest arc. Those are, in my opinion, the best of the series, and they're the best because it's Togashi at his most Togashi. It's most ambitious. The scope is just beyond what so many other series attempt to tackle, and the fact that he tackled it and just aced it is just what makes it incredible. And even as I'm like preparing this episode and the multitude of different elements we can talk about, it does remind me just how massive the scope of this is. Um, so yeah, actually, I'm going to kick off not talking about any particular point, but let's talk about the reception of the arc. It's had kind of an interesting history. I say that as someone who has. I started reading the series, I believe. I caught up around 2010 or 2011. So I think when I caught up, it was either post bomb. So that's when I caught up to the series. So I did actually miss the majority of what happened with readers in real time. Enzo, I know you experienced it with the anime and then from there onwards. So it's kind of this entire arc was like every other one in retrospect of how it was already released. So the reception, though, nowadays you would think there are outliers. Some people really, really love York New City. Um, but you would say, I would think you would agree that Chimera Ant arc is given the credit as being the best arc in the series. But it's an interesting one because I do not think if you ask manga readers during or even just after the arc wrapped up, I don't think that would be the majority consensus. I think pre-anime people would still say York New was more concise and less arduous to get through. What do you make of that? Do you think it's solely down to the experience of reading something weekly versus understanding the totality of the story?
I can't fully put myself in that position because, as you say, my first exposure to Chimera Ant was through the anime, so I was getting an episode a week. And I only experienced it in manga form to some extent while it was airing because I was doing some reading of it concurrently to try to make comparisons. But it's still the same thing. I wasn't waiting, and I do think that the bulk of the resistance to Chimera Ant, such that it exists, is because of the frustration and the just the agony that people went through of waiting interminably for new chapters in what was a story that went from cliffhanger to cliffhanger pretty much. And if you can imagine, for those of you who know Hikaru no Go, if you can imagine having to wait, 6 months between chapters of Hikaru no Go, I mean that's the ultimate cliffhanger series of all time. And so, I mean, yeah, I get it. I didn't experience it myself, but I do get why people feel that way. I will tell you that as I was covering the series on my website, and we were getting closer and closer to Chimera Ant, a lot of my commenters, a lot of people were basically saying that Chimera Ant was the best. This was the reason why they wanted this anime to exist, and blah blah blah. And a lot of that is, of course, because the first series never made it to Chimera Ant, so it had never been on screen before. And a lot of Rurouni Kenshin fans are going to say that about the Jinshu arc. Knock on wood. Once we get to that point with the new anime, a lot of people will say, "Oh my God, this is the whole reason we're here." Including me, although I will still always say Kyoto is even better. But Jinshu has never been adapted properly before in anime form. So yeah, I mean, I get it, but I think if to the extent that there is any reason above and beyond frustration, I do think it comes down to just how very unconventional it is, and how it doesn't fan service in the way you would expect a shonen battle shonen to fan service very often. I would say that.
Okay, yeah, the reason why I asked is, I mean, I have a few thoughts. This is the biggest detour that Togashi's ever taken in a series. Almost every arc feels like a detour in some way. It doesn't really go in the direction you think you're going to go. It doesn't keep you with characters that you think are the next ones you're supposed to be following. It helps that it's going in Killua, of course, getting the focus here, but 186 chapters with essentially no Leorio and Kurapika. I remember at the time people just being pissed, being annoyed that we're not getting Kurapika's follow up post York New City, of which at that point that was the most popular arc in the series. So the hiatuses, on top of the massive chapter length of this arc, which is longer than like Battle Shonen sometimes even end up being, the hiatuses just, as you say, it made it painful. But I think the hiatus also affected Togashi. I would say at his worst actually at this point because you can see it in the artwork.
Absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree. Those are
He
the
now
those are the famous bar napkin. Those are the famous bar napkin chapters, as I've heard some people call them.
exactly. So if you're basing that on those chapters, that reading experience, without seeing the final volume editions that came out months or years later, I in that way I don't blame them because it's not the optimum way to experience the arc. Compare that with what he's doing with Succession Contest, which actually has more hiatuses, but Togashi is at least under control of the output and the quality that he's putting out. You see across this arc, looking at the issues in Weekly Shonen Jump, you basically see no major deterioration in the quality of the output, which I'm really thankful for. I'm thankful compared to the experience that some people did have with Chimera Ant. So and that way, I will give it to them. Those points are fair and valid. But I think if you have experienced the anime or if you read the manga in its clean, proper, intended form, then there aren't many critiques. I think, though maybe we'll touch upon that down the line. Right,
And
let's get started.
he cleaned up most of those chapters in the volume versions, did he not?
Yes, he did. He did actually. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's quite a lot of instances of that, and as I say, he doesn't really need to do it as much anymore. Thankfully,
No,
it's
no.
kind of minor. Right, let's jump in now. So the Chimera Ant arc in itself, because it is so long, there are quite a few different segments. The first one, I think, being like NGL, which I think is kind of slept on. Mind you, I have reread this arc recently. I do that for all these arcs that we talk about as we do an episode on them. And I actually read this while I was in Japan for 2 weeks, and this was my read of choice whenever I was commuting or going somewhere on in transit. So it's quite recent that I've experienced it. NGL, I think, is kind of underappreciated because that you have this whole segment of the story pre Merorem, who just is this identity of Chimera Ant arc, and that begins with Kite. So we have this reunion with Goon, and Killer meeting for the first time, and ironically, I think for a lot of the audience, also meeting Kite for the first time, even though he is in the first chapter of the manga. You noted to me that they handled it differently in the OVA version as well in the late 90s adaptation, but in the 2011 anime, Kite is omitted from the first chapter.
He is, yeah.
That pisses off some people. I remember that being the first instance where people were like, are they going to ruin this arc adaptation that we've all been looking forward to? Personally, I mean, I want to get your take on it. Personally, I don't think it really makes that much of a difference. But I think, sure, it would have been nice to have that element of callback to the very beginning, as it was in the manga. As someone who was maybe ignorant of that, did you feel any different with Kite's introduction? Do you think the fact that he came out of nowhere, essentially, did that maybe make you like him less than you think otherwise?
No. And I will say that dealing with the 1999 haters was a daily occurrence for me when the 2011 series was airing. And we've talked about this with other series on occasion, but this is a case where the 2011 series was actually much more faithful to the manga in most respects, but you had people complaining about the changes from the 1999 version, which were actually in most cases changes from changes from the manga. So in fact, the 2011 was going back to the way the manga did things in most cases and getting bitched at for it. However, in the case you specifically mentioned, you're right. There was Kite being omitted from the first episode, whereas in fact he was introduced at that point in the manga. Personally, I think it's a nothing burger. I don't think it amounts to much of a big difference at all, really. It makes very little difference to his appearance later in the story. I actually, to the point where I think it was probably unnecessary for the adaptation to do that. I mean, I think they could have introduced him in the first chapter and spared themselves from any pushback. But in the end, it didn't make that much difference because the series won people over anyway. It's now the 8th high strength series on Mel, but it, for me, as someone experiencing it for the first time, whether Kite was briefly introduced in the first chapter or not until Chimera Ant made basically 0.001% of a difference at best.
Fair. I mean, you mentioned the 99 version as well. That's kind of being talked about at the moment on Twitter because there was the release of the unused original ending that they were going to do for that. I don't know if
Yes. Oh my
you've seen
God, I did.
where Killua there's a time skip and Killua rips out Gon's heart.
Furuhashi, what are you thinking? Kurapika dead. Of course, that's part of it too.
Well, that could still happen, potentially.
That could still happen. Yeah.
But yes, so maybe we shouldn't take the 1999 version as the beacon of representation of the series.
No.
Okay, so we got this section of the story, and even though the series has gotten darker, if you compare it arc by arc, there is a shift in tone almost immediately with the deaths of Pockle and Ponzu, who we knew from the Hunter exam arc, and they were two of the ones who, they were there with Gonakillo and everyone else, and seeing them be called off right off the jump with this threat of Chimera Ants, I think that was like the first moment where you're told, oh, things are going to play a little bit differently this time around. So with that shift in tone, and then how about we just look at the NGL section of the story, just in its totality. So when Gon and Killua and Kite go along with their expedition team, they enter this country where they have this traditional way of life. They have to like meet all these requirements and not have this outside influence, this modernity, in order to get to where the ants are. I think the NGL, like the premise of the NGL country itself, is just so fascinating.
I
So
agree
even
completely. Yeah.
the chapters when we're not even at the ants yet, and we're just seeing Gon and Killua on their new quest, and what very much at this point feels like a side quest, just exploring this new country feels. I love those chapters for all those details that we get. But from there, we have eventually the trade off for Kite and the Royal Guards and Meruem. So for the section of the story where Kite is around, up until that point in the story, so let's say up until when Kite is, spoiler, killed, what's your feelings of this segment? Because we're not even really we're not even at the, I was going to say we're not at the meat of the story, but we're not even at the potatoes of the story yet.
Well, speaking of meat, the moment you point to is definitely a big oh my god moment with Ponzu and Paco. For me, actually, the moment when I really was feeling like, wow, we're in a seriously dark place here was when Kuruto and his sister, who the human children, the boy who eventually will become Colt, the Chimera Ant, who is a very important figure in this arc, when their human lives come to an end in a pretty stark and these are young kids, and that was really dark. I mean that was really really dark, and you always have the feeling with Togashi that that to a certain extent there's no plot armor there. I mean, maybe there is in the extent that certain characters are still around in the manga now, but above and beyond that, you just get the feeling that he would do anything, and I felt like we established that pretty early in this arc, which I think really made you on the edge of your seat for much of what was playing out. I agree with you. It's a fascinating political science experiment in effect that he's created with this country and all the little permutations of it, and whether there might be certain real world countries that are suggested here. Well, we're not going to come right out and say it, but it's kind of hard not to think it. And what you realize as you get deeper into the story is that none of it was accidental. Everything he's doing is setting the table for something he's going to do later, which is kind of normal. But as you said, this arc in and of itself is longer than most battle shonen, even serialized ones. And so the early chapters, where we have the queen and just generally the NGL stuff, and just kind of the establishment of the whole Chimera Ant hierarchy, and Gon and Killua is in the midst of what amounts to almost a training arc. I think they're great. I agree with you. I don't think there's any portion of this arc that's not great. I'll spoil that now, but I don't think that first section of it takes a backseat to anything in it, as far as I'm concerned.
And I think the death of Kite kind of is that moment where this section of the story is cut. We have the birth of each of the royal guards and the King Meruem, which we could do a whole episode, I feel like, just talking about Meruem. But it is funny
We
that there
could.
is a decent chunk of this story where he is not present. And I still love this section for what it is. Most notably, I think, and this carries through into what we think could happen in future, is Gyro.
Yeah,
Um,
Gyro.
Gyro, we get so Gyro is the founder of NGL, and we get this a kind of in an arc that feels out of nowhere. We get this out of nowhere side tangent of his flashback, his backstory. He has this abusive father, and his perceptions of how he was as a parent, and the revelations that come to him. The way that the way that Gyro is depicted, both as as a young boy, and even the final time we see him, he's shrouded in this mystery where Togashi does not let us see really who Gyro is as a person. We just have this concept of who Gyro is, and all we really know about him at this point is that after he is eaten and reborn as a Chimera Ant, he is able to defy the rule and the want to appeal to the queen, and
Mm,
he leaves.
yep.
He leaves the story arc quite early on, but there is something about him that feels super vital. We do know the story tells us that he wants to spread evil throughout the world, especially in the form that he's in now. And the biggest thing, something that people still like to contemplate now, because it is one of the probably the biggest plot thread that is surely going to be come back into the story at some point, is the narrator tells us specifically. I'll read it word for word. Gyro left town and disappeared without encountering Gohan. Whether this proved to be fortunate from either party will not be known until they ultimately meet.
Yeah. Well.
So it tells us that Gyro is going to play some massive part in the story, specifically with Gohan. I have my theory of how that could play out. Do you have any thoughts about Gyro in this arc and how he's going to be
Well.
in future?
I I agree with you. It to me to this day it still feels like it kind of comes out of nowhere. And it's riveting in itself, but it does feel very disconnected from the rest of the story. And the vibe that comes out of this is really that Gyro is in some way, shape, or form the big bad. And that's how I came away from it. And it's like, oh well, he's leaving. And we don't see him again. And now it's 20 years later or whatever it is in the real life, and we don't even see Gone now, so much less Gyro. So, uh, I mean, I think judging by the words that he put in the narrator's mouth, I think Togashi had in mind for that to be possibly the final arc of the series. But whether we'll ever get there now, I think, is another question. I certainly hope we do, because it would mean Gon is coming back into the series, and that's something I very much want to see happen. But yes, I'm intensely curious about Gyro. For the brief amount of time he's on screen, he certainly makes a huge impression. We know for every one little thing we know about him, there's 1,000 things we don't. So he's a complete mysterious figure. um, I will say that if for his health reasons or if for whatever reason we never get to that point, that'd be a terrible shame, because I would sure like to know where Togashi was planning to go with that character. But right now, all we can do is guess. I mean, because that's all we got.
Yeah, what we do know is that Gyro left at the end of the series. Wilfin joins him. They go to Meteor City. And we had a little bit more of Meteor City in the succession
Yep.
contest by way of flashback. I do think
Yep.
we are going to revisit their present time at some point, which will probably overlap with various storylines. My prediction is, again, we're saying all this. We don't really know what's going to happen with the series. Could it be a George R. R. Martin situation with the Song of Ice and Fire? Who knows? Maybe we'll never get there. But my vision, or I think how I can see the story playing out, is we have maybe 3 story arcs left, potentially 2. We have Succession Contest, which is going to wrap up. I think Togashi probably already has in mind what he's going to do for that, and he's zoned in on that. People are big on the idea of the Dark Continent arc, which makes complete sense because it's been built up as where the destination is. I have my feelings about maybe that's not going to be some giant story arc in the way some people expect it to be. I think that's going to be a bit of a red herring. Things aren't going to play out the way we want, but there is still definitely potential that some capacity we'll get some exploration there. And I do think we're going to end the series with a Gohan arc with Killua back in. And I think Gyro, who knows? I think Gyro will be the villain, but maybe Gyro will also play some part in Gohan getting his powers back.
Mm.
So it is kind of fascinating that this promised dynamic between two characters who never once interacted in the story is kind of what we're hinging our expectations on. Yeah, fascinating character considering we know basically nothing about him.
Yeah, pretty
So
much.
yeah,
Those old movie fans, I'm going to make a comment here that most people probably won't, but I'm going to say Gyro is the Harry Lime of Hunter x Hunter. And if you don't know who Harry Lime is, Google the name Harry Lime, and you'll see some very interesting hits from an old movie that was one you should definitely see. So that's all I'll say on that subject.
Okay, well, I'll need to do some Googling after that then. Right, let's jump forward to the next part of. There are a couple other segments of the story before we get into the main chunk. So we get another side in an arc which has already so many side tangents. We get this side tangent with the spiders versus the ants, so the Phantom Troupe, with the introduction of Meruem and the Royal Guards. There's kind of this split and this divide between um, the ants who were introduced before then, and they're basically on cleanup duty. And this is a strange little segment of the story, which feels probably like the most conventional battle shonen that Takashi's ever been. I like it. I think it's fun, and it's always good to see the Phantom Troupe. Maybe I would say it just doesn't have the depth or level of interest in as other segments of the story. What do you make of this part? Because I actually do know a lot of people love the fights that happen here and the power. Obviously, it's nice to see the display of power that the Phantom Troupe members have. What do you make of this little like almost volume worth of chapters?
I think in an arc that doesn't give you a lot of the traditional fan servicey moments, although the ones it delivers you are honking huge, this is a fan service mini arc. Really, I mean, it's a fan like I feel it reminds me a little bit of, to some extent, the Hisoka Crollo battle in the Succession arc, and a little bit even of the maybe even the Meteor City flashback part of it too. Which the Meteor City flashback arc is a little more plot relevant, but well, maybe it isn't. But my feeling is you could take this chunk of Chimera Ant out, and I don't think it would materially change anything else that happens in the arc. And I don't think that's true of anything else in Chimera Ant. I don't think there's any similar length of material you could say, let's cut this out, and it would not change the story that much. I think this is the only one where you could say where we get to eventually would not be materially different if it didn't exist. So it's definitely the weakest part of the overall arc for me, just because it does feel less. I feel less of the weight of everything else that happens in the story. As a standalone piece of entertainment, it's great. I mean, it's vastly entertaining. It's a lot of fun. It shows us a side of the troupe that we don't necessarily see at any other time in the story, and I think that's good actually. It does flesh out them individually as characters, which I think is a positive. So I think that's kind of the legacy it has in the series as a whole. But I don't think it's as mission critical as the other parts of Chimera Ant.
Yeah, I think we're kind of on the same level of enjoyment for it. And you mentioned the Hisoka Crollo little segment in the Succession contest arc. That is a good comparison because, contrary to the popular opinion, that's actually my least favorite part of Succession contest. I had genuine critiques with that fight, which I'm looking forward to getting into when we do eventually cover that. But I would argue that that is one of the most loved just stretch of chapters, just as for a majority of Hunter x Hunter fans.
Because it's pure fan service.
It's pure fan service. And this one, like you say, is fan service, but that one just takes it to a whole other, like, a whole other, like, fanfic level.
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. I don't disagree with that at all. But
Yeah.
it's probably my favorite part of Succession, so.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that discussion.
Would make a great OVA, by the way.
It would. It would. Yeah. Okay. We have another training arc post Kite's death. Very pivotal for Gon specifically in his character journey that he goes on throughout this arc. Like we had in Heaven's Arena with Wing, and then also in Greed Island with Biscuit, we now have this moment with Knuckle and Shoot, who are like apprentices. They're of Morale. They follow Morale. How as this training arc in general, this fight that we see with Knuckle with its bizarre bizarre powers that he has. Um, what do you make of this section? And also, how do they compare to that training arc that we see with Wing and Bisky? I know we love
Uh,
Bisky, but
yeah.
yeah, what do you think?
I love Knuckle. I love Knuckle too. I think he's just an adorable anvil head. I mean, he's just a complete doof. But this arc is absolutely jam packed with characters who come out of nowhere and are just unbelievably bros and cool. I mean, this is the broest arc in the history of bro arcs, as far as I'm concerned. You have Octobro and Melioron, who's like the coolest character in the universe. I mean, I love all of these characters. I love Knuckle and I love Shoot and I love all of them. But I mean, all of the side characters in this arc are great. That's the thing. It feels almost unfair to single any of them out because they're all just fucking awesome. You know,
Even
and
Nove, I love what
yeah,
happens with Nove's
I
character.
love Nove. I absolutely. Palm, who we'll talk about, I'm sure.
Maybe.
Well, okay, but to me they're all great, and yeah, I love this arc, and I like the way Knuckle kind of becomes almost. You see, there's never any doubt in your mind with Bisky and with Bisky and with Wing that they're mentors and teachers and almost surrogate parents to the boys, especially to Gon, because Killua is such an independent-minded little scamp that he's never going to fully let himself surrender to that. But Gon is more open to that kind of relationship with an adult. But with Knuckle specifically, you mentioned him, so I'll talk about him specifically. Um, you kind of feel like both because Gon and Killua have progressed a long way themselves in their Nen abilities, and because he's maybe a little bit closer to them in age, and just generally speaking, he's kind of a childish adult. You kind of I kind of get like a literal brother relationship that he has with Gon. You almost feel like it's kind of a little brother, big brother kind of a thing, and you really feel like he's like this kid is this kid. I see Knuckle thinking this kid is like super talented and he doesn't have any idea of what the world holds for him, and he's like, I may not be Einstein or whatever, but I'm going to do what I can to try to push this kid in the right direction. And I really like that vibe. I like that dynamic, that the typical kind of Aniki relationship, if you will, even though Gon never uses that term for Knuckle. I feel that kind of exists to a certain extent. I think in a way you could almost feel like as Gon was and Gon and Killua were to Zushi, although he's not stronger than Gon and Killua, I think Knuckle is in a way almost like that to Gon and Killua.
Well, a side tangent from that, because you mentioned quite a few characters who are part of the team, the Chimera Ant extermination team. Do you have any favorites? We've discussed all these other characters. Do you have any other favorite characters that come from the Chimera Ant side? I'm going to throw, I've got two or three names. Probably we share similar ones, but the nicher you can get, the better. Icalgo is
Well,
just like one of the stars of the arc. You call him
that's who I
Octobro, I
call
think.
Octobro. Octobro, yeah, that's Octobro.
We get this bizarre fight with Killua, the throwing darts, fighting someone who's not even there. But Icalgo's moment in that, and his choice to defy his instinct and to this is one of the moments where I'm like, yes, this is a shonen arc. The like over the like power of friendship that drives Icalgo
Yeah.
to go towards Killua. There is something that just it really hits you, and the
Oh
way that that's
yeah,
done.
totally, totally.
Um,
And I love Octobro. Octobro is great. He is one of my favorites too. And the
I'm
whole
hundred.
thing that bonding thing that happens with him and Killua is so cute. It really is. It's
Yeah.
just adorable.
And then I think Meliorin, he has a very interesting part in the series as well. His like defiance of the ants and his independence and how he plays a very vital part in the
Absolutely,
extermination.
because his ability is very unique and it winds up being extremely important.
Yeah, and then another one. I mean, Koala is very cool, but also Welfin. Welfin, who I think for the longest time we were kind of kept at a distance on an emotional level, but I'll touch on this more later on when we get to that point. But I think Wilfin has maybe one of the standout moments of the entire arc. Yeah, so his moment with Mirrorim, that stands out with me a lot. And the fact that Wilfin also ties in with Gyro as well. He's the character who he's been friends with Gyro since they founded NGL, so
Mhm.
um, we shall see him as well in the future, no doubt. But
I
what do you make of the actual training? Because and you think of like Knuckles' powers. Knuckles' powers piss off everyone that encounters them, and there is almost a
well,
slight touch of like pissing off the reader as well. Like in a series that doesn't really lean into these numerical power levels and things like that, um, it's just so interesting that that's what Togashi chose as his Nen.
because he's a troll. Togashi is a troll, and essentially that's. I don't think he has more fun. I mean, he wrote a whole series where he does nothing but troll his readers, and his main character is the giantest troll in the universe, and level E. So I mean, he loves trolling. I think he writes stuff knowing God, this is going to piss so many people off, and just laughs his ass off. I truly believe that. And I think that Knuckle is absolutely intended to be annoying as hell. And then eventually you get to like, I like this guy. So yeah, I mean, but I mean, you get people like Morel, and I mean, the hunter characters. We could get started on them, but I mean, you didn't let me really get deeply into the ants that I love, and I think
Oh, sorry, go
unfortunately,
go.
or fortunately, it's the same ones because. I mean, we talked about Octobro, but Melioron is phenomenal. I think he dropped out of a jazz club on the Lower East Side of New York in the late '60s. That's kind of Melioron, and he's just this really weird kind of he's a boho, he's a bohemian, stuck in a chameleon Chimera Ant body in the middle of the biggest battle arc in show, and it totally works. I mean, and I don't know how it works, but it does. And then you mentioned Welfin. Um, that whole episode, particularly there's that like Welfin versus Octobro episode, or those chapters. The ones I'm talking about, which is like so tense and so strange, and Welfin. And I said this at the time when I was writing about it. Welfin is to me is a very Shakespearean character. He even has a name that sounds Shakespearean, and he has this kind of consistency and internal pride to him that makes him strangely admirable somehow. And it's like you never Welfin's self-doubt, and he definitely goes through this crisis of self-doubt and identity, feels incredibly real to me. And I feel like there are a couple moments in the arc where this third tier character, I mean, not even a second tier character, really, he's in the third tier, just absolutely steals whole chapters because what he's thinking and what he's feeling is so intense and so interesting and so complicated. And it's like, what writer puts so much into secondary characters? I mean, who does that? Well, Takashi does. So I mean, and so when you get into the hunters, it's kind of the same thing. This whole arc is filled with these larger than life hunter characters that are all more than they seem to be when we meet them, and even when we meet them, they seem to be pretty interesting. So
I think what is now that you're talking about all these side characters that resonate with you, it is funny to consider Succession Contest. That is another arc where you we get. I feel like we get more side characters introduced than any arc in the history of anything, and so much of them resonate with me. But they are handled differently. They are handled in Chimera Ant arc. So that's going to be an interesting one to cover when I get there. You say about all these characters where it does work for you. I'm going to throw out my major critique.
yep.
There is one character who doesn't work for me. I think,
Mm.
and especially in rereading it, I actively didn't like it. And this is Pam. particularly pre Chimera Pam. I think after that point, she has quite a vital role in the story, and she comes together quite nicely into the climax. But I think in how we're introduced to her, the trope of her character and her relationship with Gon, I feel like my question to you is, do you think Togashi takes it too far? I already know your answer, but my answer is I think yes. I think it just, in the same way that Hisoka is uncomfortable, at least with Hisoka, there is some level of entertainment that never leaves. And I didn't find this part entertaining, even if Gon himself like just took it on the chin and doesn't think anything of it. I just think their dynamic was just icky in a way that, as I was reading it, I thought, Takashi, you could have just written this slightly differently, and I wouldn't have thought anything else of it.
Well, um,
So this is your
I will.
chance. Defend the
Yeah,
relationship, Enzo.
I'm fine. I mean, I'm fine with Palm. I'll say that off the bat. She's not my favorite character in the arc, but I don't find her. I don't find her to be offensive because I feel like I kind of grok where. I'm sorry, I shouldn't use a grok. That term has become default. But I feel like I kind of understand where Togashi was going with the character. If I have a problem with Palm, it's not her inappropriateness. It's that she is a little bit over the top and kind of slapsticky in the pre Ant portion of her arc.
Yeah,
And
her
at some point,
presentation.
I feel like she's being laughed at a little too much. That the writing with her is a little mean spirited, actually, at times, which I don't love. I think that once her transformation happens, and that I think she goes on a really amazing journey, and by the end, I think she actually has a really, really kind of moving role to play in the story, and you kind of come to understand her. But I will also say that I thought the whole, and I don't remember if the manga chapters were titled this, but there was actually, I'm pretty sure, an anime episode titled "Gon's Date with Palm" or something to that effect. I thought that whole sidebar was fucking hilarious. I mean, I really did. I just really laughed at it, and I just loved Gon's complete nonchalance about it. You know, when he's telling Killua about the maniaku back in the island, he used to come and ask him to go out on dates and stuff. And he says, "Oh, Iro, you know, this and that," and Killua is just, you can see his face just completely fall, and he's like, "Oh my God, who is this person who I've been calling my best friend for the past year?" I mean, I just laughed my ass off. I thought it was really, really, really funny. And I do kind of I get where you're coming from. And like I said, the problem I have with Palm was not her inappropriateness, is more the fact that I felt like she was maybe used as the butt of the humor a little too often in a slightly mean spirited way. But I do think that eventually there is a payoff with her that makes it worthwhile. So that, you know, that's my defense for what it's worth. That's my defense of Palm.
Yeah, I agree with you that she's not treated maybe with as much respect as others are. Even someone like Shoot, who he's a fickle, funny guy, but it doesn't feel mocking. You kind of
No,
understand. You
I
understand
agree.
why he is the way
Mm,
he is, and I
mm.
think maybe yes, there is a slight disconnect in the presentation of Pam and how she fits with other characters. Off the back of that, then, before we jump into the big stretch of the series, I'm going to take this chance just because I did mention I don't care for Palm this much, Pam that much. We both love Chimera Ant arc. There are people who don't. There are people who don't say it's their favorite arc. Fine. There are people who actively think it's bad or not enjoyable, and they just don't get it. Do you think there are any critiques that are valid and like have some credit? To throw some out there, the prominence of the narrator, especially from this point in the series onwards, I think is
Mm.
quite jarring to some people. There is just the length of the series as well, that it is kind of side quest after diversion after all these things happening, um, keeping us from these other characters in the cast, which I know you feel even more now with Gon and Killua. And then at this part that we're going to talk about, which puts a whole other emphasis on like glacial pacing. the real time passage of time versus the time that we get as readers. I would say for that latter one in particular, even though I did not experience the big chunk of that week to week, I can put my head in that mindset and think, okay, if you got say like 10 or so chapters and like 1 minute and 12 seconds past end story,
Yeah,
there is
yeah.
something to that which I'd be like, okay, maybe if you're experiencing that weekly, there is something to that. Do you think there's anything that if you hear people say, oh, I hate this part about Chimera Ant arc, where you're like, fair, or do you think there is a way to get around that?
Well, that's a very, very hard question to answer because you're talking about my subjective opinion about something versus other people's subjective opinion about it. If it's a question of do you understand why some people take issue with elements of the arc? Yes, I absolutely do. And like, whole chapters where the real time passage is like 16 seconds or whatever it is. I mean, yes, I understand why. I understand why some people are not fans of that, and I understand why the amount of narration is a problem for people. I feel like, to a certain extent, that when people have issues with something Togashi does, it's when they try to put him in a conventional box. And when they start trying to hold him up to a standard which a normal, not insane mangaka would do, sometimes he doesn't meet that standard. And I think it just doesn't apply to me because I embrace that weirdness and that kind of willful disdain for convention. And if there are a few things along the way that are kind of awkward, I think that's okay. I'm more than happy to deal with that because that's the price for that's the ticket. That's how you stamp the ticket to go on this amazing journey that he takes you on. And I think you have to just kind of sit back and let the Togashi wash over you. And I think the problem comes when people start trying to judge him by a conventional standard. And that sounds like a cop out, I know. Um, but I think it's for me, that's where my truth of it is. It's as long as you don't try to judge him by the standard you would judge a more conventional writer, I think all of that stuff is there are occasional things that don't maybe work, but we're talking about 160 chapters or whatever this thing is. Um, you're not going to have perfection over 160 chapters. So on balance, I think the overwhelming number of times, I think that these things totally do work. And I think some of the best moments in Chimera Ant are some of the strangest. And I don't think that's a coincidence because I think those are the moments where Togashi kind of feels most uninhibited as a writer.
I just think so much of the negative critiques come from your experience and how you consumed the arc. I think
Fair.
there is something, you get a different experience not just with Chimera Ant arc but with any manga if you're reading it weekly or monthly, however it's released, versus binging it. And I will take any opportunity to defend Bleach. If no one is defending Bleach, I will. I was in the pits with my positivity when no one else was. But you see a resurgence in the series now. I know you're not in it, but it's getting these mal ratings. It's getting all this boost and the reputation that things are a little bit different in this adaptation. But for the large part, it's not that different from the experience that was given to us in the manga. And I see all these people changing their tune and just think, okay, I think you this wasn't the story you should have consumed in the way that you originally did. I think, yeah, there's a lot of things you can gain from just like revisiting this story arc. If you have any qualms about it, I think that will definitely show why people do love it as much as they do. All right, that about wraps up our discussion for this first half of the Chimera Ant arc. Next time, we're going to be discussing the Palace Invasion, which we've not even properly got to yet. So, yeah, stick around for that, and we'll be doing our normal recommendations and final scores in that episode. So, see you next week.